Chapter 17, A Deadly Ascent. Akia's team began their climb up the mountain with a small contingent of military escorts. The ridge they'd identified wasn't far, but the steep incline and shifting ground made every step treacherous. Loose rocks slid underfoot, and the air was heavy with smoke and ash. The roars of the two titans carried across the valley, mixing with the low hum still emanating from the fissure below. Every now and then, a tremor would rattle the earth, causing the group to halt and steady themselves. Akia carried a small case of equipment, while Kenna and two engineers struggled with the heavier components of the portable array. They moved as quickly as they could, spurred by the knowledge that every passing minute brought the Titans closer to Valley and the evacuees. How much further? Kenta panted, his hand slipping on the handle of the equipment case. Akia glanced up the trail. Not far, just a few more switchbacks. Keep moving. One of the soldiers leading the way turned back and gave a quick signal. Stay close. The path gets narrower up ahead. Watch your footing. As they continued, the glow of the fissure grew brighter, its pulsating light casting long shadows over the mountain. The air felt hotter now, as if they were approaching the mouth of a massive furnace. Akia wiped the sweat from her brow and pressed on. She couldn't afford to stop. The array had to be set up in the right spot, somewhere with a clear line of sight to the fissure's energy source. When they finally reached the ridge, the team spread out to take stock of the terrain. It was a narrow plateau, barely wide enough for the equipment. The drop on one side was sheer, disappearing into a misty abyss, while the other side rose steeply into jagged cliffs. Akia set her case down and pointed to the flattest section. We'll set up here. Kenta and the engineers quickly unpacked the components, assembling the array piece by piece. The portable amplifiers were old, relics of the early experiments, but they were the only equipment capable of broadcasting the original resonance frequency at such a scale. The engineers worked with practiced efficiency, connecting cables and calibrating the transmitters. All the while, the mountain continued to shake, and the distant roars of the creatures grew louder. Akia stepped back, watching the array take shape. She pulled a small tablet from her bag and began loading the original resonance data. If they were right, this frequency would revert the resonance to its stable state, the state that had kept the creatures dormant. But if they were wrong, she didn't let herself finish the thought. Status, she called out. One of the engineers glanced up. Almost ready. Just need another 5 minutes. Akia turned to Kenta. Start the diagnostic sweep as soon as they're done. We can't afford any errors. This has to work on the first attempt. Kenta nodded, his face drawn and serious. Got it. The soldiers took up positions around the perimeter, scanning the cliffs and slopes for any sign of danger. Akia appreciated their presence, but she knew that if one of the creatures decided to come this way, there was nothing these soldiers could do to stop it. The array was their only hope. As the final pieces of equipment were secured, a deep, resonant rumble shook the ridge. The team froze. It wasn't the usual tremor. This was different. Stronger, more focused. Akia glanced toward the fissure and saw the glow intensify. The pulse was building again. Everyone stay calm, she shouted, trying to keep her voice steady. Keep working. We're almost there. The rumble grew louder and the ground beneath them shifted. Akia felt her stomach lurch as the ridge buckled slightly. One of the engineers stumbled, dropping a wrench that clattered over the edge and disappeared into the fog below. We don't have 5 minutes. Kenta yelled. We need to start now. No. Akia snapped. Not until it's calibrated. If we rush it, we'll overload the transmitters. They won't survive the first broadcast. Another roar split the air, this one closer. Much closer. Akia's head snapped around. In the distance, through the haze, she saw a massive shadow moving toward them. One of the titans, its glowing spines visible even through the smoke, was climbing the slope. It wasn't heading directly for the ridge, but it was close enough to send a wave of panic through the team. We've got incoming, one of the soldiers shouted. Weapons ready. Hold your fire. Akia barked. It's not targeting us. Keep working. But the soldiers didn't lower their weapons. The Titan's sheer size was overwhelming, and as it lumbered closer, its footsteps sent tremors that threatened to knock them all off their feet. Akia could see the tension in the soldiers' faces. They were well trained, but nothing in their training could prepare them for this. "Almost ready," one of the engineers called out. "Just another connection to secure." "Do it faster," Akia urged, her eyes darting between the array and the approaching Titan. Kenta checked the tablet again. Frequency loaded. "We're ready to calibrate." "Do it now," Akia said. The engineers finished the final connection, and Kenta initiated the calibration sequence. The array's amplifiers powered up with a deep hum, the sound rising steadily until it matched the pulsing rhythm of the fissure. Akia held her breath. This was it, the moment of truth. The ground beneath them shook again, more violently this time. The Titan was getting closer, and its roar echoed off the cliffs. Akia could see its glowing eyes through the smoke now, piercing and unrelenting. If this didn't work, they would have no choice but to abandon the ridge and flee. "Ready to broadcast," Kenta said, his voice tight. "Do it," Akia said, her heart pounding. Kenta hit the final command, and the array surged to life. The amplifiers emitted a deep, resonant tone that cut through the noise of the mountain. The sound was low and steady, a perfect match to the original resonance pattern. Akia watched the screen on her tablet, tracking the signal as it spread out from the array and down toward the fissure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground steadied. The tremor stopped, and the air seemed to grow still. The fissure's light flickered, then dimmed slightly. Akia held her breath. Was it working? But before she could be certain, the Titan roared again, louder than ever. The ground shook once more, and the glow from the fissure surged back to life. The array's signal was fighting against something powerful. Akia could feel it in the vibrations under her feet. The resonance wasn't reverting to its stable state. It was being pushed back. "Increase the output," she yelled. Kenta hesitated. "That'll overload the system." "Do it now," she shouted. Kenta adjusted the controls, and the amplifiers whined as their output spiked. The tone grew deeper, more intense, vibrating the ridge beneath them. The fissure's glow began to waver again, dimming and flickering. But the Titan, now just a few hundred meters away, let out another deafening roar and started moving toward the ridge. "It's not enough," Kenta said, panic in his voice. "It's not." Before he could finish, the ridge buckled violently. A section of the plateau collapsed, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Akia stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing. The soldiers shouted as the ground cracked beneath them. The array trembled, its support straining against the shifting earth. Akia knew they were running out of time. If the array failed, if the ridge gave way, all hope of stopping the Titans would be lost. Chapter 18, The Last Frequency. The ground cracked and groaned as the Titan's massive form loomed closer. The glow from the fissure had returned in full force, pulsing in rhythm with the beast's thundering steps. Akia stood firm, despite the chaos around her. The array was working, but not fast enough. Whatever energy the resonance had unleashed was fighting back, a force as ancient and unyielding as the mountain itself. Kenta adjusted the controls again, his hands trembling. "We're at maximum output. If we push it any further, the amplifiers will fry. Just keep it steady." Akia shouted over the roar of the approaching creature. She could feel the vibration in her chest, the resonance building in strength. The original frequency was holding, but it wasn't overpowering the anomaly yet. The fissure's light flickered, dimmed, and then flared once more as if resisting the effort to contain it. The Titan climbed closer, its glowing spines casting jagged shadows on the cliff face. A single roar from its throat sent another wave of dust and debris down the slopes. The soldiers surrounding the ridge held their positions, but their expressions betrayed their fear. The creature wasn't heading for them, at least not yet, but its proximity alone was enough to make the earth buckle under its massive weight. Akia's gaze darted between the array and the fissure. She could see it. The slight stuttering of the light, the uneven pulses of energy. The resonance was having an effect, but the creature's presence was throwing off the balance. It was as if the monster itself was amplifying the disruption. "We need a boost," she muttered. "Something to push it over the edge." Kenta gave her a desperate look. "We're already at the limit. If we blow the array." "I know." Akia snapped, her mind racing. "But it's not enough." We have to give it one final surge, just long enough to break the cycle and stabilize the original frequency. She looked around the ridge, her eyes landing on the portable generator. We can reroute the backup power. If we time it right, we can send one more pulse before the array fails. That's a huge risk, Kenneth said. If the array shuts down mid-cycle, the frequency might never recover. We could make it worse. It's already getting worse, Akia said. We have to try. I'll handle the timing. You get ready to divert the power. Kenta hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but if this doesn't work. It will, Akia said firmly, though she didn't entirely believe it. She turned to one of the engineers. Run a bypass to the backup generator. When I give the signal, cut the main feed and switch it over. We'll only have one shot. The engineer nodded, already moving toward the generator. The rest of the team continued monitoring the array, their faces pale but determined. Akia watched the screens, tracking the signal as it ebbed and flowed. She knew the exact moment they'd need to act. The frequency wasn't just numbers on a graph anymore. She could feel it, like a pulse beneath her feet. The original pattern was almost there, fighting its way through the chaos. They just needed to push it that last inch. She glanced up. The Titan was closer now, close enough that its massive head was visible through the haze. Its glowing eyes swept across the ridge, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed to lock onto the array. Akia's breath caught in her throat. She could feel its presence, immense, ancient, and relentless. "Ready on the bypass," the engineer shouted. Akia kept her focus on the screen. "Wait for my signal." The fissure's glow dimmed again, the pulses stuttering. This was the moment. The original resonance was almost stable. If they timed it right, they could break the cycle and stop the creatures from advancing any further. "Now!" Akia shouted. The engineer flipped the switch, and the array surged with power. The amplifiers screamed under the strain, the hum turning into a deep, resonant note that echoed across the mountain. The signal pulsed, sharp and clear, cutting through the haze. The fissure's glow flickered, then steadied. The vibrations beneath their feet began to ease. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, it seemed like it was working, but then the array buckled under the stress. Sparks flew from the control panel, and the amplifiers shuddered. The deep tone wavered, then cut out entirely. The ridge was plunged into sudden silence, the only sound the distant roar of the Titan as it continued its approach. Akia stared at the screen, her heart sinking. The original frequency had collapsed, replaced by the erratic pattern once more. The fissure's glow surged back, brighter than ever. "It didn't work," Kenneth said, his voice hollow. "It wasn't enough." Akia clenched her fists. They had been so close. The resonance had almost stabilized, but the sheer power of the anomaly was too much. The energy within the fissure was stronger than they'd anticipated, and the Titan's presence had only made it more unstable. The mountain groaned beneath them, and another tremor shook the ridge. Akia realized with a sinking feeling that the battle between the creatures would not stop. They had failed to restore the balance. Now, the Titans would continue their clash, and the resonance would keep escalating, threatening to tear apart everything in its path. She turned to her team, who were already beginning to gather their remaining equipment. They would have to regroup, rethink their approach. But time was running out, and the Titans were closer than ever. The fissure pulsed, the mountain shook, and the battle raged on. Chapter 19, The Unknown Ally. The ridge fell silent, except for the groaning of the mountain and the distant roar of the creatures. Akia's team stood frozen, their failure hanging heavy in the ash-laden air. Even the soldiers, who had been prepared to fire at a moment's notice, looked uneasy. The array's final burst had done nothing to stop the chaos. The resonance remained out of control. The fissure's glow was brighter than ever, and the larger of the two Titans was now dangerously close. Akia stared at the smoldering equipment. Sparks danced along the edges of the amplifiers, and the once clear data on her screen now displayed an erratic, unreadable mess. She didn't have the strength to curse or shout. Her mind was already racing, searching for another solution. "We need to get out of here," one of the soldiers said. "Now." Kenda stepped forward, his voice shaky. "If we leave, it's over. This signal, This resonance will keep spreading. The fissure will grow, and so will whatever's inside it. It's not just about the two creatures fighting. It's what happens next. Akia nodded slowly. We need more time, more data. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we can stop it. There isn't any time, the soldier insisted, his voice rising. That thing is almost on top of us. We're going to die here. Before Akia could reply, a deafening roar shook the mountain. The closer Titan had stopped its advance. It stood at the edge of the ridge, its glowing eyes fixed on the fissure. Behind it, the second creature appeared, emerging from the swirling dust like a shadow given form. It was larger, its spiked armor glinting in the unnatural light. The two creatures faced off again, their sheer presence forcing everyone on the ridge to freeze in place. This is it, Kenna muttered. They're going to fight again. But something was different. The first creature, the one that had come from the sea, lowered its head slightly, emitting a low, rumbling growl. The larger creature responded, not with a roar, but with a strange, resonant sound that seemed to echo through the fissure itself. The glow from below pulsed in time with the sound, as if it were alive and reacting to the creature's movements. Akia's mind raced. What was she seeing? The first Titan didn't appear hostile. It seemed cautious, almost wary. The larger one, though clearly dominant, didn't attack immediately. Instead, the two massive forms stood there, the air between them heavy with tension. Something's changed, Akia said softly. Kenda turned to her. What do you mean? They're not fighting anymore. It's like she trailed off, searching for the right words. It's like they're communicating. Communicating? Kenta repeated, incredulous. Akia nodded. That sound the larger one made. It's not just a roar. It's a signal. They're responding to the resonance and to each other. The team watched, holding their breath, as the two creatures continued their strange standoff. The fissure's light pulsed in rhythm with the sounds emanating from the larger Titan. The smaller one, if something that size could even be called small, shifted its stance, its glowing eyes flickering. And then, something even more unexpected happened. The first creature turned away from the fissure. It let out a low, resonant hum, a sound that was different from its earlier roars. The larger creature remained motionless, watching as the smaller one backed down the slope. It wasn't fleeing, but rather withdrawing, as if heeding some unspoken command. Akia's pulse quickened. Did you see that? It's following an order. An order from who? Kenna asked. Akia stared at the larger creature. Its glowing blue eyes were fixed on the fissure, and its body seemed to radiate power. The resonance from the fissure had stabilized, albeit slightly, since the two Titans stopped fighting. Whatever was happening here, it was more complex than she had imagined. The resonance wasn't just a random anomaly, and these creatures weren't mindless beasts. They were connected, part of a system that humanity had only just begun to disturb. Not who? Akia said finally. What? She gestured toward the larger Titan. It's responding to the resonance, and the other one is responding to it. They're not just fighting for territory or dominance. They're reacting to something deeper, something tied to the fissure itself. Kenta's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. If that's true, maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. The resonance isn't just a trigger. It's a language. Akia nodded, a glimmer of hope returning to her voice. If we can figure out what it's saying, what these creatures are trying to communicate, maybe we can stop the chaos. Maybe we can restore the balance without destroying them. The soldiers around them exchanged nervous glances, but they didn't interrupt. Even the lead officer seemed too stunned by the display in front of them to demand an immediate retreat. For now, the ridge remained intact, and the creatures had paused their battle. The fissure's glow, though still strong, had steadied. It wasn't a victory, but it was a moment of clarity. Akia realized they had been fighting the wrong battle all along. The answer wasn't in stopping the Titans, but in understanding them. Chapter 20, The Cradle of Power. The creatures remained still, their titanic forms framed by the pulsating glow of the fissure. Akia's mind raced as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The resonance wasn't just a random geological phenomenon. It was a force of communication, perhaps even a form of control. These creatures weren't fighting for territory or dominance alone. They were reacting to the signals that had been triggered, and maybe even receiving orders from a deeper source. Kenta, still clutching the last of their salvageable equipment, broke the silence. If that larger one's in charge, what do we do? Try to communicate back? Find a way to alter the signal again. I don't know if it's that simple, Akia replied. The resonance is more than just sound. It's a pattern, a code. If we alter it the wrong way, we might make the situation worse. But we can't just sit here. Kenna's voice was tense. If the resonance triggered them, then we need to figure out how to stop it, permanently. Akia stared at the larger titan. It spiked. Crystalline armor reflected the glow of the fissure like a living fortress. The other, smaller titan still lingered at the edge of the ridge, its body visibly tense. She thought back to the data they collected. The resonance had been stable for years, centuries even. What had changed? What if the resonance isn't just communication? Akia said, her voice soft. What if it's energy? Kenna frowned. What do you mean? Think about it, Akia continued, stepping closer to the equipment and pulling up what little data they still had. The resonance didn't just wake these creatures up. It's sustaining them. Look at the glow from the fissure. It's pulsing in sync with their movements. When they roared, it grew stronger. When they stopped, it dimmed. Kenta leaned over her shoulder, watching the remaining readouts. You think the fissure is a power source? Not just any power source. I think it's been feeding them, keeping them alive, maybe even keeping them dormant until something disturbed the balance. Kenta's eyes widened. So if we shut down the resonance completely, they might stop, Akia finished. If we can stabilize the energy output, turn the resonance back to its dormant state, then they'll have no reason to keep moving, no reason to keep fighting. But how? Kenna asked. We barely managed to boost the signal last time, and the ray fried. We don't have equipment to contain something that powerful, let alone reverse it. Akia closed her eyes, trying to focus. Maybe we don't need to contain it. Maybe we need to redirect it. Kenta blinked. Redirect it? To what? To them, Akia said, pointing at the larger titan. If the resonance is a source of energy and communication, then sending a control pulse could force them into stasis. It wouldn't destroy them. It would reset them. But it has to be done carefully. One wrong adjustment, and we could cause another surge. That's an insane risk, Kenna muttered. If the pulse is too strong, we could trigger an even bigger catastrophe. We don't have another choice, Akia said firmly. We've seen what happens when the resonance runs wild. If we can get back to the core frequency, back to the stable state that kept them contained, then we have a chance to end this without further destruction. Kenta nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edges of the equipment case. Okay, how do we start? Akia took a deep breath. We'll need to reanalyze the old data and isolate the original frequency. But more than that, we'll need to create a new pattern, one that's strong enough to reach the fissure in the Titans, but controlled enough to avoid another overload. And that means we need better equipment. The facility is destroyed, Kenna pointed out, and everything we had here just fried. Akia looked toward a larger Titan again, watching as it stood motionless above the fissure. There's one place we haven't checked. If the fissure is what we think it is, then its source might still have intact structures, something we can use to generate the pulse. You're talking about going down there? Kenna asked, his voice rising. Yes, Akia said, her tone unwavering. If we want to stop this, we need to go straight to the cradle of the resonance, to the source. Kenna hesitated, then gave a resigned nod. All right, if that's what it takes. Akia turned to the remaining team members and the soldiers. We need a small team. The rest of you will stay here and monitor the situation. If anything changes, let us know immediately. We'll send updates as we go. One of the soldiers, a young officer with a steady gaze, stepped forward. I'll guide you down. But once we're inside, you're in charge. Akia gave a small nod of thanks. She turned back to Kenta. Let's move. The longer we wait, the harder this is going to get. The group began their descent, heading toward the fissure's edge. The glowing light grew brighter as they approached, the pulse of the resonance growing louder in their ears. The mountain trembled again, but Akia pressed on. Whatever lay at the heart of the fissure, whatever secrets it held, was their last chance to understand the creatures, the resonance, and the ancient power that had been unleashed. Chapter 21. Into the Abyss. The closer Akia's team approached the fissure, the more palpable the energy became. The air was heavy, each breath feeling like it carried the weight of the mountain itself. The ground was no longer solid. Fine dust and loose stones shifted beneath their feet, and the glowing light from below cast long, eerie shadows over the jagged walls. The soldiers accompanying them were silent, their faces grim as they tightened their grips on their weapons. No one knew what to expect. Akia led the way, her focus entirely on the pulsing light ahead. Every step closer brought a new layer of sound, an oscillating hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through their bones, a reminder of the raw power they were approaching. Kenna followed close behind, carrying what equipment they had managed to salvage. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. The soldiers flanked him on both sides, their boots crunching softly against the shifting terrain. Dr. Fujimoto, one of the soldiers said, his voice steady but low. "What exactly are we looking for?" "A source," Akia replied, not taking her eyes off the fissure. "Something we can use to stabilize the resonance. The original pattern came from down here. If we can find its origin, we might be able to redirect it." The soldier didn't ask further, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. He was trained for combat, not for descending into glowing chasms filled with ancient unknown forces. They reached the edge of the fissure. The light was blinding now, a pulsating brilliance that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Heat radiated upward, but it wasn't like any natural heat Akia had felt before. It wasn't just hot, it was alive. The resonance wasn't just a sound or a signal. It was something far more complex, something that defied conventional explanation. A narrow, rocky ledge extended downward, curving along the fissure's edge. It was just wide enough to walk single file. Akia glanced back at her team. "Stay close and watch your footing. One slip, and we won't be able to get you back." Kenta swallowed hard, but nodded. The soldiers exchanged a quick glance before moving into formation behind her. As they descended, the oscillations in the air grew stronger. Akia could feel them in her chest, her head. It was almost disorienting, but she forced herself to stay focused. The walls of the fissure glowed faintly now, veins of light running through the stone like molten rivers. They illuminated the path ahead, revealing strange patterns etched into the rock. They weren't natural formations. They looked deliberate, almost like carvings, symbols that Akia didn't recognize. Kenta stopped, staring at one of the patterns. "Dr. Fujimoto, look at this." Akia paused and turned back. Kenta was pointing at a section of the wall where the veins of light converged into a circular shape, surrounded by intricate lines and shapes. It didn't look like any geological phenomenon she had ever studied. It looked designed. "What does it mean?" one of the soldiers asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," Akia admitted, "but it's not random. This was put here, by someone or something." The hum grew louder, and the ground underfoot began to tremble again. The team pressed on, the glowing patterns on the walls becoming more frequent and more elaborate. Akia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led deeper, as though the fissure itself was guiding them. After what felt like hours, they reached a cavernous chamber. The fissure widened here, opening into a massive space that seemed almost too large to fit beneath the mountain. The light was brightest at the center, where a massive, crystalline structure rose from the ground. It pulsed with energy, each rhythm sending waves of sound and light through the chamber. "This is it," Akia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where the resonance originates." The soldiers held back, their weapons drawn, but their expressions uncertain. Kenta stepped closer to Akia, his hand shaking as he set down the equipment case. "What do we do now?" Akia walked toward the crystalline structure, her heart pounding. The carvings on the walls seemed to converge here, their patterns etched into the base of the crystal. She reached out a hand, hesitating just before touching it. The surface glowed faintly, and she could feel the vibrations running through her fingertips. This isn't natural, she said softly. It's a construct, a mechanism. Kenta stared at her. You're saying someone built this? Akia nodded, though she didn't have the answers yet. It's generating the resonance, or at least amplifying it. Whoever or whatever created it knew exactly what they were doing. She turned back to the team. If we can figure out how this thing works, we might be able to reset the resonance. It won't be easy, but this crystal is the key. Kenta hesitated, then began unpacking the remaining equipment. We'll need more data. If we can scan it, maybe we can isolate the core frequency. But how do we adjust it without destroying everything? Akia didn't answer immediately. She stared at the crystal, feeling the hum in her bones. She had never encountered anything like this before, but she couldn't let that stop her. Whatever this construct was, it was the only chance they had to bring the resonance back under control. We'll figure out, she said, but we have to hurry. Those creatures aren't going to wait forever. Chapter 22, The Crystalline Key. The chamber was impossibly vast. Its ceiling vanished in the darkness above, and the glowing fissure now spread out like a river, cutting through the stone floor in intricate channels that converged beneath the massive crystal formation. The closer Akia approached, the more she felt the weight of the energy radiating from the structure. It wasn't just a resonance anymore. It was something far older and more deliberate. This was no accident of nature. Kenta and the engineers set up what remained of their portable instruments, their hands moving quickly despite the oppressive heat and the disorienting hum that filled the chamber. The soldiers stood at the edges, their weapons ready, though against what they weren't sure. Every few minutes, one of them would glance back toward the glowing fissure, as if expecting something to rise out of it. Akia ran her hand along the surface of the crystal's base, her skin tingling. The material was cool to the touch despite the heat in the air. Its surface was perfectly smooth, as though it had been polished by careful hands. Yet the veins of light running through it pulsed and shifted like living currents. These patterns, Kenta said, holding a small scanning device to one of the glowing carvings. They aren't random. The spacing, the angles, they match some of the resonance frequencies were recorded before everything went haywire. Akia nodded. This crystal isn't just a structure. It's a conductor. Whoever created it designed it to channel and control the resonance. But control for what? Kenta asked. Akia hesitated. I think it was a containment mechanism. The resonance itself is raw energy, but if channeled properly, it could stabilize the creatures, keep them dormant. That's why they've been here for so long, and why they only woke up after the resonance destabilized. She stepped back and studied the crystal. If we can understand how it works, we might be able to reintroduce the original pattern and restore the containment. Kenta frowned. But what if it's not just containment? What if it's also a trigger? Whoever built this might have done it to keep something asleep, but what if that same mechanism can wake it up? Akia glanced at him, her expression serious. That's why we have to be careful. If we make the wrong adjustment, we could unleash more of these creatures, or worse. As Kenta and the engineers continued to scan the crystal, Akia's mind raced. The patterns on the surface of the crystal seemed almost familiar, like echoes of something she had seen before. She remembered the old myths, the stories of ancient guardians of the earth, sleeping deep beneath the oceans and mountains. She had always dismissed those tales as superstition, but now they seemed like fragments of forgotten truth. The chamber trembled again. The resonance pulsed brighter, and for a moment, Akia thought she heard a low, distant sound, like a deep, resonant voice. It wasn't one of the Titans. It was something else. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning toward Kenta. He nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the crystal." Akia stepped closer. The hum had shifted slightly, becoming more rhythmic, more deliberate. She placed her hand on the crystal's surface again and closed her eyes, trying to sense the pattern. The vibration was subtle, but it wasn't chaotic. It was a code, a signal that repeated over and over. "This isn't just energy," Akia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a message." Kenta gave her a sharp look. "What kind of message?" "I don't know," she said, her brow furrowed. "But if we can decode it, we might be able to understand what this crystal is trying to do." and maybe we can use that knowledge to stabilize the resonance. The engineers worked quickly, connecting their scanners to the crystal's surface and feeding the data into their laptops. As the information began to stream in, Kenna adjusted the parameters, trying to isolate the repeating patterns. Akia watched the screens closely, her mind racing to match the waveforms with the old resonance data they had recorded before the outbreak. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional tremor and the low hum of the crystal. Akia's team worked methodically, but the pressure was mounting. The creatures above would not remain dormant forever. If the resonance grew more unstable, it could trigger another surge, and then there would be no stopping them. Finally, one of the engineers spoke up. "I think we have something. Look here." She pointed to a screen displaying a series of overlapping waveforms. "This pattern matches the original resonance frequency before it destabilized. It's faint, but it's still present in the crystal's core." Akia leaned over the screen. "If that's the original pattern, then we can amplify it. But we have to do it carefully. If we push too hard, we'll destabilize the whole structure." Kenta nodded. "What's the plan?" Akia thought for a moment. "We'll introduce a controlled signal, just enough to reinforce the original pattern and suppress the chaos. If it works, the resonance should return to its stable state, and the creatures will stop reacting to it." "And if it doesn't work?" Kenna asked. Akia looked him in the eye. "Then we'll be out of options." The chamber trembled again, and the fissure's light flared brighter. Akia turned back to the crystal, her resolve hardening. They had come this far. They couldn't fail now. Chapter 23. A Controlled Surge. The team gathered around the crystal's base, each person moving with deliberate urgency. The pulse of the fissure had grown stronger, the oscillations in the air thickening like a storm about to break. Akia had never felt so small, standing before construct that clearly transcended human understanding. Yet, even as her hands trembled, she knew there was no choice but to act. "All right," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "We're going to start by syncing our signal generator with the crystal's core pattern. If we match its current frequency and then gradually amplify the stable waveform we've identified, we should be able to suppress the chaos." Kenan nodded, his face set. "You said gradually. How gradually?" Akia glanced at the screen, where the engineers were refining the data. "Enough to keep it from destabilizing, but fast enough that we see a response before it's too late." One of the soldiers shifted uneasily. "How will we know if it works?" "The resonance should smooth out," Akia explained. "The glow will stabilize, the vibrations will lessen, and, if the theory holds, the Titans will stop responding so aggressively. But we need to do this carefully. If the signal climbs too fast, it could cause the fissure to erupt." The soldier nodded, but his expression remained grim. None of them could shake the image of the Titans clashing above, their roars echoing even down here. They were all acutely aware that if this attempt failed, those beasts wouldn't just be fighting each other. They'd come crashing through everything in their path. Akia turned to Kenta. "Start the initial calibration." Kenna adjusted the controls on their portable generator. The device let out a soft hum as it synced with the crystal's frequency. The lights on the console blinked in a steady rhythm, slowly matching the pulse of the fissure. Akia watched the screen closely, looking for any anomalies. "So far, so good," she said, her voice steady. "Now, introduce the stable pattern." Kenna tapped a few keys, and the generator began to broadcast a controlled signal into the crystal. The hum deepened, resonating through the chamber. For a moment, the glow of the fissure dimmed, and the air seemed to settle. "Keep it steady," Akia instructed. "Don't rush the amplification." The engineers monitored the readings as the generator gradually increased the amplitude. The crystal's pulse shifted subtly, the chaotic waves smoothing out into more predictable patterns. The chamber grew quieter, the oscillations more regular. For the first time, Akia allowed herself a small flicker of hope. "It's working," she said. "The resonance is stabilizing." Kenta adjusted the output again, carefully increasing the power. The fissure's glow continued to steady in the low. The disorienting hum in the air began to fade. Akia glanced at the monitors, then at the crystal itself. The patterns etched into its surface were now glowing in harmony, their lines of light pulsing in time with the stable frequency. Then, without warning, the chamber shook violently. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the air, and the fissure flared brighter than ever before. The glow was blinding, and the ground under their feet heaved like a ship caught in a storm. "Shut it down!" Akia shouted. Kenta scrambled to cut the signal, his hands flying over the controls. The generator went silent, and the chamber was plunged into a tense, vibrating stillness. Akia stumbled, catching herself against the crystal's base. Her heart pounded as she waited, her ears ringing. "What happened?" Kenna asked, his voice tight with fear. "We were stabilizing it." Akia didn't answer immediately. She stared at the fissure, which still pulsed with its otherworldly light. The resonance had smoothed out, but the sudden flare suggested something else was happening, something beyond their control. "Look," one of the engineers said, pointing at the readings. "The frequency isn't destabilized anymore. It's locked." Akia leaned over the screen, her brow furrowed. The data showed a steady, stable pattern. The chaos had stopped, but the resonance wasn't fading. Instead, it had settled into a high, continuous state. "This isn't right," she said softly. "It's stable, but it's still too strong. It's like it's holding itself open." "Open for what?" Kenna asked. Akia shook her head. "I don't know, but this isn't containment. It's activation." The words hung heavy in the air. The team exchanged nervous glances, the soldiers tightening their grips on their weapons. Above them, the mountain trembled again, and a faint roar echoed down the fissure. The Titans were still active, their battle far from over. "We need more data," Akia said firmly. "We have to understand what this new pattern means. If we've shifted the resonance from chaos to control, we need to know what it's controlling." Kenta hesitated. "And if it's controlling them? Then we've only just begun to understand what this crystal was designed for," Akia replied. She turned to the engineers. "Run a full scan of the stabilized signal. We need every detail. If we can decode this pattern, we might be able to predict what happens next." The team got back to work, their fear and uncertainty palpable. Akia couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a revelation, one that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the creatures, the resonance, and the ancient power beneath the earth. The chamber hummed softly, the glow from the fissure now eerily calm. But in that calm, Akia sensed the weight of something far greater stirring just beneath the surface. Chapter 24. The Echoed Warning. The chamber's light had steadied, casting a pale, even glow over the team as they worked. Akia's fingers moved deftly over the keyboard, running new analyses on a stabilized resonance pattern. Kenna and the engineers adjusted their scanning equipment, fine-tuning the instruments to pick up even the subtlest variations. The soldiers kept their positions near the edges of the cavern, their sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. Akia could feel the pressure mounting, though not just in the task at hand. Something about the chamber's newfound stability felt wrong, too still, too deliberate. The air was heavy, filled with a tension that made every sound echo just a bit longer, every vibration feel a bit stronger. The Titans hadn't stopped moving above ground, but their roar seemed more distant, more muffled, as if the crystal's steady resonance was dampening their rage. "Dr. Fujimoto," Kenna called, motioning her over. "Look at this." Akia stepped beside him, her gaze dropping to the screen he was pointing at. The waveforms had evened out completely, forming a clean, rhythmic pattern. It was almost soothing, as if the crystal's pulse had become a steady heartbeat. But what caught Akia's attention wasn't the shape of the waves. It was the additional lines that had appeared faintly beneath them. "What is that?" she asked, leaning closer. "It's faint, but it's there," Kenna said. "Another pattern. It wasn't visible before we stabilized the resonance. I think it's a secondary signal." Akia frowned, her mind racing. A secondary signal or a response? Kenta gave her a startled look. "You think it's responding to something?" "Not just responding," Akia said slowly. "I think it's echoing something back, like a beacon." She turned toward the crystal. The massive construct glowed steadily, the veins of light in its surface pulsing gently. The patterns that had once seemed chaotic now appeared purposeful, forming intricate shapes that resembled ancient symbols. Akia's heart sank as a realization began to take shape. This crystal isn't just a container, she said. It's a transmitter. The room went quiet. Even the soldiers turned to look at her. A transmitter? Kenta repeated. A transmitter to where? I don't know, Akia admitted. But this secondary signal, it wasn't here before. It only appeared after we stabilized the resonance. Whatever we've done, it's not just calming the energy. It's sending a message. One of the engineers shifted nervously. A message to what? Akia didn't have an answer. Her mind raced back to the carvings on the walls, the stories of ancient guardians and buried powers. The resonance had been dormant for centuries, kept in check by this crystalline construct. Now it was active, stable, and, if her theory was correct, broadcasting. We need to isolate that secondary signal, Akia said. If we can understand what it's transmitting, we might be able to figure out what this crystal is really for. Kenta hesitated. And if it's sending a warning? Then we need to know who or what is listening, Akia replied. As the team began extracting the secondary signal, the air in the chamber seemed to grow colder. The steady hum of the resonance was no longer soothing. It felt heavier, more oppressive. Akia glanced at the soldiers, who were scanning the chamber walls nervously. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by the Titans, but by something deeper, something that had been asleep even longer than the creatures above. The data streams finally appeared on her screen. Kenta worked quickly to isolate the faint secondary signal, adjusting filters and amplifiers. When it finally became clear, Akia's stomach turned. The pattern wasn't just a sequence of random waves. It was structured. It had repeating intervals, deliberate variations. It wasn't noise, it was a code. This isn't natural, Kenta said, his voice almost a whisper. No, Akia agreed. It's a signal, a very old signal. The engineers stared at the screen in silence. They didn't need Akia to explain. The pattern spoke for itself. It wasn't something generated by a natural process or a random occurrence. It was deliberate, purposeful, and it wasn't human. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down everyone's spine. Akia turned sharply, her eyes darting toward the crystal. Its glow had grown brighter, its pulse stronger. The stabilized resonance was shifting again, not into chaos, but into something more controlled, something more focused. What's happening? One of the soldiers asked, his voice tight. Akia's breath quickened. It's responding to the signal. It's waking something. The fissure's light flared, and the carvings on the walls glowed more brightly than ever before. The entire chamber seemed to hum with life, the sound growing louder, more layered, more complex. The secondary signal wasn't just broadcasting, it was building. Each wave added to the next, creating a rising cascade of energy that vibrated through the ground. Kenta's hands flew over the keyboard. The frequency is climbing. I don't think we can stop it. Akia's heart raced. She had wanted answers, but now she wasn't sure she was ready to hear them. Whatever this crystal had been built to contain, it was no longer dormant. The resonance wasn't just stabilizing. It was awakening something ancient, something that had been hidden deep beneath the earth for millennia. The Titans above hadn't been fighting over territory. They hadn't been drawn here by chance. They were responding to this signal, this crystalline transmitter, this forgotten power. And as the resonance climbed higher, as the patterns grew clearer, Akia realized that the creatures were only the beginning. Something else was coming, something the crystal had been trying to keep locked away. Chapter 25. The Third Awakening. The fissure blazed like a second sun. The chamber's walls, once just a maze of carvings, now thrummed with light and energy. Akia stood frozen, staring at the crystal as the frequency climbed higher. The secondary signal wasn't a glitch, nor a side effect of stabilization. It was deliberate, a response as old as the crystal itself. Something had been triggered deep within the earth, something that even the Titans above seemed to understand and fear. Kenta scrambled with the equipment, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Dr. Fujimoto, we need to shut it down. I know. Akia shouted back, but she didn't move. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The resonance, the crystal, the titans. They weren't random elements. They were part of the system, one that had lain dormant for centuries. Now that system was fully online, and it wasn't just stabilizing, it was activating. The floor beneath them rumbled again, and for a moment, Akia thought she heard something that chilled her more than the Titan's roars. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a sensation that clawed at the edges of her mind. The resonance was no longer just vibrating through the stone. It was resonating through her very thoughts, pulsing in perfect sync with the crystal's light. Kenneth turned to her, panic in his eyes. Akia, we have to cut the signal. It's pulling in more energy. If it keeps climbing, the whole chamber might collapse. She forced herself to move, stepping closer to the console. Her hands trembled as she reached for the controls. We need to dampen it, she said, her voice shaking. If we just cut it, we might cause another surge. We have to bring it down gradually. I don't know if we have time for gradual, Kenta replied. Another roar echoed from above. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, their faces pale. The Titans were still moving. Akia glanced at one of the monitors. The readings showed steady, controlled resonance levels, but the secondary signal was growing stronger, branching into frequencies she had never seen before. It's not just resonance, she murmured. It's a call. What do you mean? Kenna asked. Something deeper. The Titans were responding to it, but they weren't the target, Akia said. The crystal was waiting for the right conditions to send this signal, to send it somewhere or to someone. Kenda stared at her. You're saying this isn't just about stabilizing the resonance. It's about awakening something else. Before Akia could answer, the chamber was filled with a new sound. A low, guttural rumble reverberated through the fissure, louder than the Titans above. It wasn't just a roar. It was a voice, deep, ancient, and utterly alien. The air seemed to thicken, the light from the fissure shifting into strange, swirling patterns. The crystal flared, its glow blinding. Everyone get back, one of the soldiers shouted. Akia shielded her eyes, backing away from the crystal. The ground cracked beneath her feet, a new fissure forming just inches from where she stood. The air felt alive, charged with an energy she couldn't fully comprehend. Her head throbbed as the sound grew louder, deeper, resonating in her very bones. And then it came. The ground split open, and a massive form began to rise from the depths. Unlike the two Titans above, this creature moved with a terrifying grace. Its body was covered in jagged, crystalline armor that mirrored the glow of the chamber. Its eyes burned with a blue light that pierced the darkness. The hum of the crystal had become its voice, a harmonic resonance that made the chamber itself quake. Kenda stumbled backward, his face pale. What is that? Akia didn't answer. She couldn't. The creature, this new Titan, was larger, more formidable, and it moved with a purpose that the others lacked. It wasn't just a beast. It was a guardian, a living embodiment of the resonance that had been locked away. The soldiers raised their weapons, but Akia shouted, No! Don't fire. Dr. Fujimoto, it's... Don't, she yelled. It's not attacking us. It's responding to the crystal. The creature took a step forward, and the chamber shuddered. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, their patterns shifting in perfect harmony with the Titan's movements. It let out another low, resonant call, and the crystal responded, its pulse aligning with the creature's voice. The air in the chamber grew heavier, the pressure almost unbearable. Kenta grabbed her arm. We can't stay here. If that thing moves any closer... Wait, Akia said. Just wait. Her instincts told her to run, but something about the Titan's movements held her attention. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't rampaging. It was moving deliberately, its glowing eyes fixed on the crystal. The resonance continued to climb, but the chaotic energy from before was gone. Everything about this felt planned, controlled. The Titan reached out with one massive, crystalline limb, touching the surface of the crystal. The chamber went silent. The hum ceased, the glow steadied, and the air became still. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Then, with a sound like a bell tolling through the earth, the crystal flashed once, twice, and then went dark. The fissure's light faded. leaving only the soft glow of the carvings. The Titan stood still, its arm resting against the crystal. The room was plunged into a heavy, waiting silence. "What just happened?" Kenta whispered. Akia stared at the Titan, her heart pounding. "I think it's contained. The resonance, the signal, it stopped." The Titan slowly turned its gaze toward them, its glowing eyes softening. It let out one last, low call, a sound that was less threatening and more deliberate. Then it stepped back, retreating toward the fissure. As it moved, the crystal remained dark, silent. Whatever power it had been channeling was gone. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. Akia stepped closer to the crystal, running her hand over its now dull surface. The carvings no longer glowed, and the chamber felt eerily calm. "It's not gone," she said quietly. "Just dormant again." Kent approached cautiously. "Is it over?" Akia shook her head. "Not over. Just paused. For now." The Titan gave one final glance toward them, then turned and descended into the fissure. The team watched as its massive form disappeared into the depths, leaving behind a silence that felt as heavy as the resonance itself. Whatever this creature was, whatever purpose it served, it had chosen to retreat. And for the first time since their journey began, the chamber was still, but Akia knew that stillness would not last forever. Chapter 26. A Temporary Peace. The chamber's silence weighed heavily on the group. Akia stood at the base of the now dark crystal, her hand still resting on its smooth surface. She stared at the carvings, searching for clues, patterns, anything that might explain what had just happened. The Titan's retreat left her feeling relieved but uneasy. They had seen it descend into the fissure, its massive, glowing form fading into the depths. But that didn't mean the threat was gone. Kenta slumped against a nearby rock, wiping the sweat and grime from his face. "It left," he said, his voice raw. "I don't believe it. It just left." "It responded to the crystal," Akia said, her tone thoughtful. "I think it was waiting for the resonance to stabilize. When we locked it in place, it came up to, I don't know, check, confirm something. Or to stop it," Kenna muttered. "Maybe it knew we'd tamper with the balance and wanted to set it right." Akia turned to him. "It didn't attack. It could have destroyed everything in this chamber, destroyed us, but it didn't. That has to mean something." One of the soldiers, who had stayed near the edge of the room, spoke up. "Dr. Fujimoto, if the resonance is stabilized, what's keeping the other two creatures active?" Akia frowned, her thoughts racing. "The resonance down here might be stable now, but that doesn't mean the overall energy has dissipated. The Titans above, they were drawn here, and they've already started their conflict. They might still see each other as threats, even if the source of their unrest is no longer chaotic." Ken sighed. "So, even though we've calmed the resonance, we haven't stopped the fight. What's the point if they're still tearing each other apart up there?" Akia paced the chamber, her gaze flicking between the fissure, the crystal, and the dimly glowing carvings on the walls. This was always about balance. The resonance, the Titans. It's all tied to an equilibrium we didn't understand. We thought we could stabilize it, contain it, but the truth is, we've only temporarily paused the instability. The Titans will keep fighting until they're either exhausted or one of them is gone. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. Akia could feel it too, a sense that they were still only scratching the surface of something far greater than themselves. Kenna rose to his feet, his expression grim. "So what do we do now? Wait? Hope they just go back to sleep?" "No," Akia said firmly. "We can't leave it at that. We've stabilized the resonance for now, but the fact that this crystal started transmitting a signal means it isn't just a passive structure. It's part of the system, one that we don't fully understand." She gestured to the carvings on the walls. "These patterns aren't just decoration. They're instructions or records. We need to decode them. If we can understand what they mean, we might be able to predict what comes next and how to truly stop the conflict." One of the soldiers stepped forward. "You're saying we stay here? Keep working while those things are still up there?" Akia looked at him, her expression resolute. "If we don't, this will happen again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but the system will destabilize again. And next time, we might not have a chance to stabilize it. Kenta crossed his arms, considering her words. So you're saying we dig deeper, figure out what this crystal was built for, who built it, and why it started transmitting now. Yes, Akia said. We're not just scientists anymore. We're custodians of something ancient, something that's been buried for centuries. If we don't understand it, we can't protect it. And if we can't protect it, then everything we've done here, all the lives lost, all the destruction, will have been for nothing. The chamber fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the oppressive silence of the unknown. It was a pause, a moment of clarity before the next step. The soldiers looked at their commanding officer, who gave a small nod. The engineers glanced at Kenta, who sighed, and began powering up their remaining instruments. And Akia turned back to the crystal, her mind already racing with possibilities. They had stopped the resonance from spiraling out of control. But the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The titans above still raged, and the mysteries of the crystal remained unsolved. Akia knew they had only bought themselves time. And time, she realized, was their most precious resource. With that thought, she stepped forward, ready to begin the next chapter of their journey into the unknown. Chapter 27. Cracks in the foundation. Even as the chamber grew still, Akia couldn't shake the feeling that the balance was fragile. The titans above might be beyond their immediate reach, but the resonance and the crystal's deeper purpose remain an unsolved puzzle. She stared at the glowing carvings, their patterns flickering faintly like the dying embers of a fire. The engineers worked quickly to re-establish their scanners and recalibrate what equipment had survived. Kenna ran a diagnostic on the data they had pulled before the crystal went dark. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his fingers moved deftly across the keyboard. Akia stood nearby, her arms crossed, trying to focus on the intricate details of the carvings while suppressing the mounting weight of their situation. This might be something, Kenta said, breaking the silence. Look at these intervals. Akia walked over to him, glancing at the screen. The patterns in the data weren't random. They followed a sequence. Not just a signal, but a code, one that repeated, almost like a refrain in a song. Her mind immediately raced to ancient myths of rhythmic chants or rituals meant to appease the forces of nature. Could this code be something similar, a repeated phrase meant to hold the world in balance? It's a loop, she murmured, a stabilizing sequence. A loop we didn't know existed, Kenna said. When we adjusted the resonance to stabilize it, we must have nudged it back into this original state. But it didn't turn off. It started echoing something deeper. Akia's eyes flicked back to the crystal. This crystal wasn't just a container. It was a conductor. When we reintroduced the stabilization signal, we didn't stop the system. We reactivated a larger process. The Titans were drawn to it because they're part of that process. Kenta's voice dropped. And that secondary signal, it wasn't meant for us. It was meant for something else. Akia nodded slowly. And whatever was meant for might still be listening. The engineers, who had been quietly working at the far end of the chamber, stopped and turned toward them. One of them, Mariko, a younger researcher who had been unusually quiet since the crystal first flared, spoke up. Dr. Fujimoto, if this crystal was built to stabilize a resonance, why would it have a secondary signal? What purpose would that serve? That's what we need to figure out, Akia said. It's possible the crystal's designers never intended for it to broadcast. Maybe the signal was a failsafe, something that only activates if the system breaks down. Or maybe, she hesitated, considering the implications. Maybe it was always supposed to send that message at a specific time or under certain conditions, and we've triggered it by accident. Mariko frowned. But if that's true, and if it's still broadcasting in some way, then it means we're not done, Akia finished. We need to find out what the signal is for. If it's a call for help, who's it calling? If it's a warning, who's it meant to warn? Kenta leaned back, rubbing his temples. And if it's neither, then it's something else entirely, Akia said. Her voice was calm, but inside she felt a familiar grip of uncertainty. The crystal, the titans, the resonance. Everything was connected, but she still didn't know how. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions. The soldiers had begun to relax. Though their stances remained wary, they had followed orders and survived a potentially catastrophic event, but they were not trained to parse ancient codes or theorize about signals from an unknown civilization. They simply waited for the scientists to tell them what would come next. Akia turned to the lead soldier. "Captain, can you send word to the surface team? I need to know if there's any change in the Titan's behavior." He nodded and stepped out of the chamber to relay her request. Akia returned her attention to the crystal, stepping closer once more. The smooth surface seemed inert, but she knew it was far from lifeless. She placed her hand against it, hoping to feel the resonance again, but there was nothing. Whatever power had surged through it earlier was now dormant, or waiting. "We're missing something," she said, almost to herself. "Something about this crystal's design. The carvings are like a language, but we don't have a Rosetta Stone. We're just guessing." Mariko stepped forward. "What if we're looking at it too literally? The carvings might not be a language in the traditional sense. They could be instructions, blueprints." "Blueprints for what?" Kenna asked. "For how to use the crystal," Mariko said. "Not just to stabilize the resonance, but to control it. If this thing is a conductor, then these patterns might show us how to direct the energy more precisely." Akia considered her words. "If that's true, then we've only used a fraction of the crystal's capabilities. We stabilize the resonance, but if the patterns are instructions, there might be a way to tune the signal further, to shut down that secondary transmission." Kenan narrowed his eyes. "You think we can actually stop the signal?" "If we understand what it's broadcasting," Akia said, her voice growing more confident, "and if we can follow the patterns on the crystal, we might be able to neutralize it. That could give us a chance to truly restore balance." "But it's a gamble," Kenna said. Akia turned to him, her expression firm. "Everything about this has been a gamble. We've come this far. We can't stop now." The team began photographing the carvings, carefully documenting every line and curve. Akia's mind spun with possibilities. If they could decode the patterns, they might uncover not just a way to stop the signal, but the purpose behind it. And with that knowledge, they could finally understand what this ancient system was meant to protect or prevent. As they worked, the fissure remained quiet, the glow barely perceptible. But the weight of the chamber, the feeling of something vast and ancient just beneath the surface, lingered. Akia knew that the crystal's silence wasn't an end. It was only the beginning of something much larger. Chapter 28, The Language of Light. The carvings were far more intricate than they had first appeared. As Akia and her team carefully documented every line, they began noticing subtle differences in the patterns, variations in spacing, the depth of the etchings, and the direction of the lines. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking, using a visual language that none of them yet understood. Mariko was the first to notice a potential key. "These," she said, pointing to a cluster of interconnected spirals, "appear repeatedly in different sections of the chamber. And if you trace the lines, they all lead back to the crystal." Akia frowned, leaning closer. "A central point. The patterns seem to converge there, but they don't end. It's like a flow, energy moving through a system." "Or a guide," Mariko said. "The spirals might represent steps in a sequence. If we can find where they start and follow the progression, it could show us the correct order of adjustments." Kenta folded his arms. "We're still just guessing. We have no context for what these patterns mean. Even if they are instructions, we have no way to confirm we're interpreting them correctly." Akia glanced at the crystal, still dark and silent. "We have the resonance data," she said. "The patterns might match changes in waveform. If the spirals represent frequency shifts, we can cross-reference them with the signals we recorded before and after stabilization. It's a long shot, but it might help us translate." Kenta sighed. "All right, but even if we figure out what these carvings mean, how do we know it'll stop the secondary signal?" "We don't," Akia admitted, "but we know the crystal was designed for a purpose. If we can understand that purpose, we might have a chance at shutting the signal down and preventing another surge." The team worked tirelessly, documenting every inch of the chamber walls. They took high-resolution images of the carvings, comparing sections that repeated and tracing how the patterns connected. Mariko and Kenna collaborated on creating a digital map of the chamber, overlaying their resonance data onto the visual designs. Bit by bit, a picture began to form. As they pieced together the carvings, Akia began to see the chamber not just as a holding place for the crystal, but as part of a larger mechanism. The spirals and lines didn't just decorate the walls. They appeared to direct the energy that once flowed through this place. The entire chamber was a conductor, the crystal at its heart. "It's a machine," she murmured. "A massive, ancient machine. The crystal isn't just a transmitter. It's part of a control system. If we follow these patterns correctly, we might be able to reconfigure it." "To what end?" Kenna asked. "To stop the signal. To restore balance," Akia said. "Or at least understand what we've unleashed." A few hours into their work, one of the engineers called out, "Dr. Fujimoto, I think I've found something." Akia walked over, her eyes narrowing at the section of wall the engineer had highlighted. The carvings here were deeper, more intricate, and unlike the others, they glowed faintly. The faint light wasn't the bright, pulsing glow of the fissure. It was subtler, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a faint, steady shimmer that seemed to shift as she moved closer. "These symbols are different," Akia said. "They're not just spirals. They're geometric." Mariko stepped closer. "It's almost like circuitry." Kenda frowned. "Circuitry? This chamber is carved into solid rock. That doesn't make sense." "None of this makes sense," Mariko replied. "But if these patterns are channels, paths for energy or information, it would explain why they glow. Something is still flowing through them." Akia reached out, her fingers brushing the glowing lines. As soon as she touched them, a faint vibration pulsed through her hand. She jerked back instinctively, but the glow didn't change. Instead, she felt a strange clarity, as if a thought or memory had briefly flashed through her mind. It was gone before she could grasp it, but it left her heart pounding. "What just happened?" Kenna asked. "I don't know," Akia said, shaking her head. "But these carvings aren't just instructions. They're active. Active how?" Mariko asked. Akia thought back to the resonance, the signals, the Titan's behavior. Everything had been part of a system, a balance that humanity had disturbed. The crystal was at the center, but the carvings, these glowing pathways, might hold the key to restoring that balance. They weren't just carved symbols. They were part of the machine's interface. "We need to decode these," Akia said. "If these patterns are active, they might respond to the stabilized resonance. If we can align them properly, we might be able to redirect the signal or shut it down entirely." Kenta looked doubtful. "You're talking about interacting with an ancient, alien system we don't understand. If we get it wrong, we're no worse off than we are now," Akia said. "But if we get it right, we can stop the transmission, stop the Titans, and stop whatever might come next." Mariko nodded. "It's a risk, but it's the best shot we have." Akia turned to the team. "Let's get back to work. Document everything, compare it to resonance data, and see if we can match these glowing pathways to the stabilized signal. If we're right, we might finally have a way to stop this." The engineers and researchers resumed their work, now focusing on the glowing carvings. Akia felt the weight of what they were attempting, but she also felt a spark of hope. The answers lay in these patterns, in the strange language etched into stone. If they could understand the carvings, they could unlock the system's secrets and prevent another disaster. The chamber was quiet except for the sound of their work. The glow of the carvings illuminated their determined faces as they pieced together the language of light, hoping it would lead them to a solution. Chapter 29. The Guiding Patterns. The team worked through the silent hours, their movements mechanical and precise. Akia couldn't shake the sense of urgency pressing down on her. Every new section of the carvings revealed another piece of the puzzle, but the solution remained frustratingly out of reach. The crystal's dormant state was a temporary reprieve. She was sure of that now. The signal hadn't vanished. It had only been quieted. Something deeper was still at play. "Here," Mariko said, pointing to a particularly complex segment. "This section isn't like the others. The lines are sharper, more angular, almost mathematical. It's not just a flow pattern. It looks like instructions for how the energy moves. Akia knelt beside her, tracing the etched lines with her eyes. The geometric patterns radiated from a central point, branching out like spokes on a wheel. Each spoke ended in smaller, repeating symbols, tiny spirals, loops, and angles that seemed to mirror the resonance waveforms they recorded earlier. These aren't just instructions, Akia said softly. They're a sequence, a process. If we follow the sequence, we might be able to redirect the resonance, maybe even reverse it. Reverse it how? Kenta asked, stepping closer. Think of it like rewinding a clock, Akia explained. If we send the energy through these pathways in reverse, it might cancel out the signal that's already been sent. Instead of amplifying, it would nullify. Kenta raised an eyebrow. And if we mess it up? Akia stood and looked back toward the dormant crystal. If we get it wrong, the resonance could surge again. The secondary signal might get stronger. But if we do nothing, we know it will reactivate sooner or later. This might be our only chance to stop it before it reaches a tipping point. Mariko nodded slowly. We need to carefully map the entire sequence. We can't miss a single step. If this is truly a reverse flow mechanism, every line matters. The team returned to documenting and comparing, the faint glow of the carvings casting eerie reflections on their faces. Hours passed as they worked to piece together the sequence. Each segment seemed to fit into the next, forming a complex network of interconnected instructions. Akia felt a strange clarity as she studied the patterns. For the first time, she felt like she was beginning to understand the language etched into the stone, not through words, but through logic and flow. At last, Kenta called out, I think we have a complete map. Akia hurried over to where he had projected the map onto a screen. The sequence stretched from one side of the chamber to the other, a labyrinth of lines and symbols that all connected back to the crystal at the center. This is it, Akia said. If we follow this, we should be able to send a reverse signal and shut down the secondary pattern. How do we know this won't just restart the whole system? Mariko asked. We don't, Akia admitted. But these patterns weren't designed haphazardly. If the original purpose of this chamber was to control the resonance, this sequence might be the fail-safe. Kenta frowned. You're betting a lot on a hunch. It's not a hunch, Akia said firmly. It's a hypothesis based on the data. Everything points to the sequence being the key. We have to try. The room fell quiet as the team prepared for the next step. They would need to replicate the sequence in reverse, using the remaining instruments and what power they had left. It would take precision, and any mistake could be catastrophic. Akia took a deep breath. Let's begin. They worked together, carefully calibrating the equipment and matching each step of the sequence to the map they had built. The room seemed to hold its breath as they started the process. The glow of the carvings grew brighter as the energy began to flow. Akia watched the readings closely, her heart pounding as the waveforms on the monitor started to align with the reverse sequence. At first, nothing happened. The resonance remained steady, the crystal dark. Then, slowly, the waveforms began to shift. The carvings pulsed in time with the changes, and the glow of the fissure dimmed slightly. Akia's grip on the console tightened as the process continued. They were so close. The ground rumbled faintly beneath their feet. The carvings flared brighter, their light now radiating in complex patterns that spiraled toward the crystal. The crystal itself began to glow faintly, its dark surface coming to life once more. Akia's breath caught. It was working. They were reversing the flow. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. The carvings pulsed faster, the crystal glowing brighter. Akia glanced at the monitors and saw the waveform stabilizing, the erratic signals fading into smooth, controlled pulses. Keep it steady, she said. We're almost there. The hum intensified, building to a crescendo. Akia braced herself as the final steps of the sequence played out. The crystal flashed once, twice, then dimmed. The carving's glow began to fade, and the room fell silent. The resonance had stopped. The waveforms on the monitor flatlined, leaving only a faint, steady line of stability. Akia exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. It's done. The signal is neutralized. Kenta stared at the monitor, Then at the dark crystal. It's gone. Not gone, Akia said. Dormant. We returned it to its original state. No secondary signal. No chaos. Mariko smiled faintly. Then we did it. The system is back to balance. Akia nodded. For the first time in what felt like weeks, she allowed herself a moment of relief. But she knew the work wasn't over. The titans above still lingered, their presence tied to the resonance they had just stabilized. And the carvings, this strange, ancient language, still held secrets they had yet to unravel. For now, though the crisis was averted, they had restored balance, if only temporarily. And in that fragile peace, Akia saw hope. They had faced the unknown and prevailed, and she was determined to uncover the full truth behind the resonance before it awakened again. Chapter 30, Silent Guardians. In the aftermath, the chamber felt impossibly still. The carved walls no longer pulsed with light, their intricate patterns frozen, as if they had never moved. The massive crystal stood quietly at the chamber's center, its surface dark yet resolute. The resonance had been quelled, and for the moment, the team had achieved what they set out to do. Akia lowered herself onto a nearby stone, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She'd spent every ounce of her focus and strength navigating the alien logic of the carvings, deciphering patterns that no one alive had ever seen before. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about what it all meant. Kenda crouched next to her, the glow of the now inert carvings casting faint shadows on his face. "So what happens now?" he asked. "The signals stopped, but what about those creatures? They're still out there." Akia looked toward the chamber's entrance, as if she could see through the layers of rock and earth to the world above. The titans had retreated, at least for now, but their very presence was a reminder that their work was far from over. "They'll settle down eventually," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Without the resonance destabilizing them, they'll have no reason to keep fighting. They might go back to wherever they came from. And if they don't?" Mariko asked, stepping closer. She held a tablet displaying the digital scans of the chamber's walls, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. Akia didn't have an answer. She looked back at the carvings, the remnants of a long-lost design. Whatever civilization had created this chamber, they had understood the resonance and its consequences far better than she or anyone else could. They had built this place to maintain balance, to prevent chaos, and perhaps even hold something greater at bay. "We've stabilized the resonance for now," Akia said finally, "but we can't just walk away. These carvings are a map, one we barely understand. The crystal, the energy flow, everything is part of a system that's older than we can imagine. If we don't stay and learn, we risk another destabilization." Kenda's brow furrowed. "Are you saying we should keep the team here? Study this place?" "I'm saying we need to understand what we found," Akia replied. "We've seen what happens when the resonance breaks down. If it destabilizes again, we might not get another chance to fix it. We need to know exactly how the system works and why it was built." Mariko tapped the tablet, zooming in on a section of carvings they hadn't fully deciphered. "There are parts of this map we still don't recognize," she said. "Some of these symbols, they're not just instructions. They look like warnings." Akia nodded slowly. Whoever built this knew the risks. They left this system in place to maintain order. But the carvings might also tell us what happens if that order is broken. The soldiers standing near the chamber's edge exchanged uneasy glances. They had come here expecting to defend against something massive, something tangible. But the enemy hadn't been a creature. It had been the resonance itself, a force they couldn't see or touch. And now they were being asked to remain, to protect something they barely understood. Captain Takeda, the team's commanding officer, finally spoke up. "Dr. Fujimoto, if we're staying here, we'll need clear orders. This chamber isn't exactly defensible if those titans come back." Akia met his gaze. "We'll need more equipment, more researchers, and better infrastructure. But if we don't stay, if we don't protect and study this place, the risk of another destabilization is too great." Kenda sighed. "And what happens if we find something we don't like? Something we can't control?" Akia didn't answer immediately. Her eyes drifted back to the crystal, Its massive form a silent guardian over the system it had stabilized. She knew that understanding this place wouldn't be easy. It would take years, decades maybe, to fully decipher the carvings, to learn what this chamber had been built for. But she also knew that walking away wasn't an option. "We face it," she said simply. "Whatever we find, we face it. Because if we don't, we'll never be ready for what comes next." The chamber was quiet again, the silence heavy but not oppressive. For the first time since the resonance had surged, there was no rumble beneath their feet, no alien hum in the air, just stillness. Akia stood, her exhaustion replaced by a quiet determination. They had stopped the signal, but their journey into understanding had only just begun.